to lead off this seminar. I haven't, unfortunately, been to any of the earlier ones, but I have read at least the outlines of what they were about. So, as Ian says, we're not going to be talking specifically about poverty, but we will do some points at which the links are made. But what I'm going to be talking about is the links or linking education research and poverty, policy generally, rather than just on poverty. By way of sort of preamble, let me say I'm talking here particularly about the education research government policy nexus. And so what I say will apply specifically to that, and my skepticism is related to the extent to which educational research can influence government policy. But there are slightly different considerations about the relationship between educational research and institutional policy or classroom practice. So I don't want you to map over directly what I'm saying about research and government policy to suggest that research has very little influence on anything. But I am going to express skepticism about the push there's been in the last few years towards linking our work as researchers to the demands of the public policy agenda. And there'll be a few caveats, but that's the main message. And indeed, as many of you know, and as Ian has suggested, I am at heart a sociologist of education, and I have worked mainly in the areas of inequalities in education, the relationship between educational inequalities and social inequalities, and that of course includes looking at the relationship between poverty and education. And that's the core, really, of my academic work, inequality. And not just looking at the poor, but looking at how the education of the middle class impacts upon the education of the poor. And in some ways, my talk today is a story of how, having spent most of my life as a sociologist of education, I became a bit, not too, I don't think, but a bit seduced away from the sociology of education into trying to be more engaged with government policy, influencing policy, and I'll talk about that period of my life, and then end with how I decided that probably that wasn't the way to go, and returned to sociology of education in my dotage. So, as many of you know, sociology of education has gone through various fads or phases, and I suppose I was brought up initially on the old sociology of education, represented there by, does anyone here recognise them?
Thanks.
Jean Flood and Halsey, who was here, although I don't think he often came to this building, but in Nuffield and social policy. And it's said that that work that they did helped bring about the policy of comprehensive secondary education in England. And I'll nuance that a bit later on. I then, in terms of my career, was much more involved with the so-called new sociology of education, represented there by my friend and colleague Michael F.D. Young. And that, as some of you will know, veered between what I call the possibilitarian phase, where educational change would come from teacher and pupil agency, and didn't worry much about things like government policy, to almost the opposite, semi-deterministic phase, which said there can be no meaningful change in education without political transformation, political and economic transformation. As I say, I was involved in those debates, but in the 1980s, my interest really shifted towards what you can call education policy and empirical studies of education policy making. And partly with a view to influencing policy, I suppose, when I first went into it. But then political reality intervened, and we had Margaret Thatcher, first of all, and subsequently Tony Blair, with neoconservative policies of state control through the national curriculum and assessment, and neoliberal market forces, which were specifically parental choice and school autonomy. And it wasn't just me, it was people like Ian Mentor here, but notably Stephen Ball at King's College London, who were centrally involved in Sociology of Education policy. Now, in some ways, Stephen's work at King's and at IOE, and my own work at Bristol Poly and at IOE, funny that. Have to cut that bit out of the film. It was very much policy critique rather than policy influence. Although we were highly outraged at the socially regressive effects of Thatcherite policy, I have to say there was also a little bit of, oh, isn't that great they've brought in that extreme policy, because it illustrates our theory and it gives us an occasion for critique. So I think our relationship to Thatcherite policy was almost a love-hate relationship in that sense. But when Tony Blair's New Labour government came in '97, some people hoped that sociology of education would move beyond critiquing policy and have some positive influence on policy itself. Although its continuation of the policy of parental choice and school diversity as the key to educational improvement and closing the attainment gap were increasingly at odds with the arguments of sociologists like Stephen Ball and his colleagues. Now, reflecting back on things, one of my few claims to have influenced government policy was right at the start of the Blair government, with the abolition of the previous government's assisted places scheme that took, or was supposed to take, poor kids, poor bright kids as they would have said, into elite private schools. And the research that I did with Tony Edwards and John Fitz showed that the scheme didn't work, and this was widely cited to justify the change of policy. It was widely cited critically throughout the previous government, and then the first government policy of the Blair government was the abolition of this scheme, citing our research and saying they were going to use the savings for the more progressive purpose of reducing class sizes in infant schools. But that was a relatively easy win because our research played to the apparent ideological preferences of the incoming government, probably not continuing ideological preferences, arguably, but they said they were for high quality education for all rather than excellence for the few. So it could be considered an easy win. And thinking about it beyond that, and the more positive influence of the EPI project, partly based here in Oxford, it's frankly difficult to discern much in the way of serious research influence on policy, even under New Labour. And of course we had even less influence on the coalition government, and that extended New Labour policies on academies, free school, and introduced free schools, and put them alongside a more neoconservative set of policies, particularly based on Gove's view, quoted there when he was in opposition, that working class children needed exposure to the traditional curriculum rather than all these progressive ideas coming through things like the new Sociology of Education. And that led to things like curriculum examination reforms, specifically the EBAC. Ironically, within Sociology of Education itself, we had Michael Young's change of heart, arguing against progressivism and constructivism, and indeed his own earlier work, and offering a critique of it, at least as powerful as that of any conservative politician. Now, I have sometimes teased Michael at my stage in 2008 and said, "Are you writing Michael Gove's speeches?" And there was quite a parallel between them. The parallel is, of course, not an influence, and I can't find any evidence of a direct link. Michael told me the other day, he met Nick Gibb, who said, "Oh, you're the man who changed his mind, aren't you?" So they recognised him as one of us now, but I don't think you could say there was any direct policy influence. You might say there was a zeitgeist that encouraged both these sets of similar ideas, but not direct influence. Now, I myself became a bit distanced from Sociology of Education around this time, and soon after I was appointed director of the Institute of Education in 2000, someone referred to me as Geoff Whitty, who used to be a sociologist in education. And it is true that for the time being, partly because of my role as director of the Institute of Education and also president of Bureau, I became more involved with generic issues in educational research and trying to represent the importance of our whole field to government. But I very soon came to the view that was a pretty uphill struggle. And when I gave the Bureau presidential address in 2005, I focused on what was becoming a key issue for educational research generally at that time, and that was the government's What Works agenda and the push for research to be oriented ever more strongly towards answering questions of policy and practice. And ever since that time, the mantra of evidence-based policy and practice, research for use, have been pursued with increasing enthusiasm. One of my prime concerns was the effect this would have on the field of education generally, in terms of the sort of research that was deemed worthy of funding. And I argued that while we should expect some education research to be aligned in various ways with immediate questions of policy, some of it would be regarded by governments, and was regarded by governments, as being of limited value or irrelevant, even though it was important to the development of the field as a whole. And I remain of the view that a healthy education research community must be a broad church encompassing activity that responds directly to external priorities, but also, crucially, curiosity or discipline-led inquiry. Now, in 2005, I pointed to a number of worrying signs about this more Catholic approach, particularly in the hands of politicians like David Blunkett, but also during the 90s there have been some pretty vicious attacks on educational research for being poor value for money, remote from educational practice, indifferent quality from within our field itself. And the challenge for us became to take criticism seriously, but defending the breadth of the field, such that others' assumptions and priorities didn't come to reshape our field in their image. And this meant, I argued, resisting attempts to impose narrow or inappropriate quality criteria, themselves based in narrowly formulated notions of use and impact. The worst case scenario in 2005 was that research in the What Works mould would become the only research deemed worthy of funding on any scale. And then the subsequent creation by the coalition government of the Education Endowment Foundation, with its focus on randomised control trials, represented a step in that direction, led by these two. Do you know who these two are? Yeah, Kevin Collins and Ben Goldacre. This was a strong push by the coalition government in that direction, but of course so was the impact agenda of Research Councils UK and of course the Research Excellence Framework, which had a fairly simplistic notion of how research outputs and research impacts would be related. And one of the main findings of the evaluation of universities' REF preparations in trying to evidence impact was that in the social sciences it was all about showing impact on government policy. And one commentator said there was a lot of lying about that, and I couldn't possibly comment on that, but certainly said creative writing in the impact case studies. And some respondents to that evaluation voiced concerns that in future universities and researchers would prioritise research that could more easily demonstrate immediate impact, some of which might be trivial. A lot of things that you can do an RCT on are relatively trivial. And this isn't necessarily slavishly following the requirements of REF overnight, but subtle shifts in the overall profile of research, so you've got enough impact case studies and so on. Now, the REF isn't true that it expects immediate impact. I can't remember what the period of time is. Is it some 15 years? Is it something like that? I always remember my mentor, Basil Bernstein, talking about sleepers and research in all fields, scientific fields, I mean nuclear science is the obvious one, where the research only later comes to be seen as relevant, and in that particular case with devastating consequences. But the impact and public engagement agenda has been so dominant that we ourselves, as social scientists, have produced reports that show how we influence policy. And not surprising, we focus on particular things. We focus, like the Campaign for Social Science report, The Business of People, looks at behavioural science and the use of big data and how they can effect behavioural nudges and so on. None of which is a problem, except when there's silence about all the rest of the research. And BERA itself is not totally innocent of this in its 2013 Why Educational Research Matters reports. Now, these reports are targeted unashamedly at politicians, but they don't represent our field in the round. And it's not, I'm not arguing that some research shouldn't influence policy and practice, but it's when you're almost embarrassed about the other research that it becomes a problem. I accept that strengthening interchange between research and policy for some types of research is important, but even that, I think, is based on a utopian vision of how these things are related. And it has implications for blue skies research and critical traditions in research, which become precariously positioned in this context. And we looked at this in the BERA USEC report in 2012. I think some of those things we worried about have come to pass. Not just in terms of departmental policy in university departments, but individual researchers are looking at where they might put their efforts. Now, of course, some researchers might say, this is worth doing. If I can do influence there, are not there. I'm going to focus where I can have influence. But it's really important to recognise the structural and cultural disjunctions that exist between even policy-facing research and the realities of policy making in practice. In that BERA address in 2005, I highlighted the gap between research and policy. I think I would argue that it was based on a false prospectus, that if we produced high quality research, government would take notice of it and act upon it. And I think that belief will lead to frustration on all sides, as well as a denuded discipline, and ultimately probably even less considered policy making. It's not a question of whether there should be constructive engagement between research and user communities. It's also about who are our user communities, and I'll come back to that. But also about what form that engagement should take. John Nisbet, in the first BERA presidential address 40 years ago, argued then that we moved away from the naive idea that problems are solved by educational research, what he called the old educational science idea. And rather, he said, the relationship between research and policy is indirect and more about sensitising policymakers to problems rather than solving them. Yet the current what works agenda seems to represent a resurgence of the educational science idea, not least in this enthusiasm for a medical model of research as the gold standard. In my view, Nisbet's warning 40 years ago that educational research may not provide answers, final answers to questions or objective evidence to settle controversies, and his support for a broad spectrum of research really needs to be heeded afresh. And before people do head down the road of seeing policy influence as the be-all and end-all, they should look at how politicians actually use evidence. Although they talk about evidence-based policy making, they are, as has often been said, more prone to seek policy-based evidence. There's little use of evidence other than anecdotal in their speeches or even in white papers. And I would argue that it's naive of us to expect that there would be. And I cite a number of examples in my new book where education policy is being driven by ideological and electoral considerations rather than research evidence. And you'll remember that I mentioned that the money from the assisted places scheme was to be diverted to support the reduction of class sizes in infant schools. Now, there is strong research evidence of that, and David Blunkett quoted it. But what he didn't quote was what that research said, and nor did he acknowledge that he knew, and I assume he did, that nearly all the classes over 30 were not in inner city areas, which he was implying, but in suburban, leafy suburbs. And why was that? Which you didn't need votes from the inner city. The swing constituencies were the leafy suburbs. And when I said to him, okay, maybe you didn't know that, but what research actually says is for disadvantaged groups, you need to reduce class size below 15, not below 30. Why don't we put that in the next manifesto? Surprise, surprise, there was no mention of it. And then I've come across a more recent example of how electoral politics drives the agenda. You know, David Cameron had this thing, which was actually wrong, where he claimed there were more black men in prison than in Russell Group universities. And his figures, as some of you will know, are actually wrong, though that hasn't been widely publicised. But UUK set up a group at his behest to look at how we could get more ethnic minorities and other disadvantaged groups into university. And nearly all the research says you have to start early in outreach activities in primary schools and so on, and that work done in the upper end of secondary schools is not really where it's at. But what I was told by a researcher who was approached for evidence was we've been asked for evidence of things that can be done to increase the number by 2020, which of course is when the election is. And so the research says, well, actually, you've got to start earlier, and there's not much scope for doing it in that period, but that's all they appear to be interested in. Now, some politicians, I'll speed up, are very clear about that. Charles Clarke was one, and I've even heard it alleged that one Tory minister who has said he didn't want more research on something because it might give him the wrong answer. I wouldn't say who that was because I wasn't there. But I do know that Nick Gibb, a current government minister, gave a speech recently drawing very selectively on OECD research where it supported his position and rubbished it where it didn't. Now, it's not just education research. I mean, Paul Flynn has said more generally, much of our policy making is evidence-free, prejudice-driven, and hysteria-driven, particularly press hysteria. So we need to recognise that our work, we need to recognise, I'm saying, that our work will be used when it suits, but not when more important considerations come into play. And it's interesting that some of the evidence-based policy people outside the academy have begun to recognise the limitations and call for a greater degree of realism about what can and can't be achieved. James Turner of the Sutton Trust and the EEF has recently said rhetoric's considerably easier than the reality, and expressed serious reservations about how it's all going to work. His conclusion was that reorientating all parts of the system is a massive challenge, and it was going to take an incremental approach. He's ultimately still attracted by a refinement of the education science model, but is pulling back from the grand claims of evidence-informed policy, asking for more modest ambitions. For me, though, actually the conclusion is that the messy world, real world of educational politics he points to justifies maintaining the diversity of educational research rather than following any particular model. And that's what, in some ways, has taken me back to the sociology of education. And that's what my new book, Research and Policy in Education, is really about. The early chapters are actually about what I've just been talking about. But then there's a couple of chapters that are perhaps more relevant to the theme of the Commission, looking at evidence on ways of narrowing the social class achievement and participation gap. Not surprisingly, even in areas of considerable consensus like these, the evidence doesn't simply speak for itself, nor is it conducive to quick fix solutions to politicians' problems. I'm going to leave Ian Mentor to critique the language of achievement gaps later on, and I'm going to take it at its face value for the moment. Under New Labour, there was, as you can see, a very slight narrowing of the achievement gap at age 16, and indeed that shows that it actually, the narrowing was for a time going faster for the most disadvantaged groups. So you could say from that that the poverty angle was being tackled. And similarly with widening participation, there was a reduction, although that's actually been exaggerated. But you'd have to agree actually with this highly loaded coalition government statement. Gaps in education performance are narrowed only very slightly, despite significant investment under New Labour. And not only have they narrowed only very slightly, if you look at the detailed evidence, in all the things that count in terms of access to higher education, elite professions and so on, they haven't narrowed at all. And so when I was writing the chapters about this, I found myself drawn right back to sociological theories, especially theories of social and cultural reproduction, Bernstein and Bourdieu in particular. And although that sort of work isn't undertaken with a particular view to policy impact, it's really helpful in understanding why policies have such limited impact and what might be needed to enhance their impact. And so I end the book with a plea for more discipline-based research on education, and particularly sociology, and align myself with one of my predecessors as director of the Institute, who once said, educational theory and educational policy that take no account of sociological insights will be not only blind, but positively harmful. And I think that was a very important statement. So, drawing towards a conclusion, this means that a lot of our research won't be about providing solutions to problems like the relationship between poverty and educational achievement in any simple sense. It will be about elucidating and examining the nature of such problems, and this makes the politician's simple dichotomy of useful and useless research rather unhelpful. And I think educational researchers need to embrace the role of public intellectual rather than political servant or even technician. But it's interesting how at a time when other academics are adopting the role of public intellectuals, it's very hard to find public intellectual from the field of education. And interesting, you mentioned Danny Dawley, who is the public intellectual who talks most about these issues, does not come from education, it comes from geography. Some of us were ARA, where they were focusing on engaged or public scholarship. And that doesn't just mean public, it means professional, community, and so on. And I think BERA needs to do more to look at that, because it allows us to engage with policy in less constrained ways than the debate about evidence-based policy and what works. It doesn't mean eschewing the impact and public engagement agenda, but does mean reframing them away from the narrow definition that existed in the last REF exercise. Part of our work is in providing evidence of what doesn't work, and I suppose the assisted basis scheme example was one of those, but more important, why, helping to understand, helping to inform public debates about why, and strengthen the public mind on education and increase resistance to superficial but seemingly attractive policies. And one observer called this a form of inoculation against policy epidemics like the great global education reform movement. And that takes me, interestingly, right back to the old sociology of education that the new sociology of education tended to reject. Shelley Housey, who I mentioned, once argued that the task of the sociologist is literally to inform debate. And I think we've been much less involved in public debates recently. But our role in making sense of evidence remains crucial. And I hope that the sociological voice may be heard along with other philosophical voices and so on in policy circles, if necessary, if possible rather. But I think we should be refocusing towards wider public and professional debates. And interestingly, going back to that example of comprehensive secondary education, Olive Banks really questioned whether Housey and co. had as much influence over government policy as is often claimed. And the reality of their influence was as much on the public mind through public debates as it was on influencing policy behind closed doors. And I think there's something to take note of there. And as I say, I think I was a bit seduced towards more direct influence. And I don't even think influencing think tanks is the way to go. But that's a debate we might have. And just finally, in this context, what's interesting is that the old and new sociology of education seem to have come together with a common message that we might take out into the new. Although I tend to reject the title, let's take me as an example. In March this year, I wrote, policymakers need to be much clearer about what schools and universities can and cannot do, or at least cannot do on their own. This is clear from recent empirical research that shows that even when disadvantaged groups achieve success in the education system, we see a shifting of the goalpost and the creation of class ceilings and glass floors that seem to protect the position of already advantaged groups. And that's subsequent to my saying that has been very strongly evidenced by an IFS report that came out in April.
It's a very strong message from the Paired Peers project at Bristol, comparing people at Bristol and uni, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very strong.
And it's all lining up, and they're old sociologists, John Goldthorpe saying at the British Academy in March, same month, what can be achieved through education policy alone is limited, far more so than politicians find it convenient to suppose, or I would probably say to suggest for public consumption. To look to the educational system itself to provide a solution to the problem of inequality of opportunity is to impose an undue burden on it. Rather, a whole range of economic and social policy is needed. So perhaps now we're both arguing the same thing, it's harder to dismiss, and certainly the Commission should take note that education solving problems related to poverty on its own is not the way to go. And it seems to me that we need to reinstate our voice, influence policy if possible, but largely enter broader public and professional debates on the side of equity and social justice. And those sorts of educational research that ask those sorts of questions need to be supported rather than derided, as has been too much the case both from without and within in recent years. My view is it's much more important than a race towards policy impact at any price, because that actually is a dead end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Time for comments, questions, disagreements?
There's been a bundling together, hasn't there, between an argument that maybe education research could be more useful, in a broad sense of the word, and the notion of quick fix.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
To hold those two separate. And the way in which the EF toolkit operates is determinedly quick fix. It's what can you prove in terms of your intervention and benefits to attainment results within 12 months.
Yeah.
It's that frame. I mean, what I find quite disturbing at the moment is the combined impact of three different moves. One is toolkit and evidence-based notions, which the medics are rejecting.
Yeah.
The second is the notion of think tanks, and not just policy exchange, centre forum and so on, and the way that collusion with the big money agenda. But perhaps even the biggest concern, the one I least know what to do with, is the research ed movement, this spurious, desperately anti-theoretical, collusive with government, supposed teacher research.
Yeah.
It's big, it's far bigger than I think we suspected it might be 3 years ago.
Yeah, and the leader of that, of course, is part of the behind closed doors policy making agenda. I had lunch with Bill Taylor, who some of you know, yesterday, and he was someone who was the first chair of, he was director of the Institute of Education, he was was also first chair of the Council for Accreditation of Teacher Education, and was very much an insider and very critical of people like me in the 1970s. But he read my book and said, I agree with you, that's what it's about. And we were going through who the current policy advisors were, and they don't come from our world. And I think we should take a message from that rather than knocking on closed doors, actually seeing our role as different and not inferior, and in some ways superior in that approach.
I'm going to revert back to the 1980s and say that I very much understand where you're coming from, but I don't think you really take into account the different kinds of influences of new social movements of the 80s, feminism, anti-racism, which actually came from a different kind of, it came from sociology, but it came from other places. And it transformed, it didn't, for a while anyway, it transformed a lot of the perceptions of teachers as well as academics. And there's that, so I think there's a kind of loss there in your account. And I think that's the problem with being a sociologist, that, and focusing on sociology, rather than focusing on education. So I would say that, because I wanted to say, you referred hardly to any women at all in the people, that was me reverting to the 80s. What about the women? Olive Banks was the only woman sociologist, and Jean Flood, yeah, too, but everybody else was. And I don't really want to focus just on why not the women, but I think it is a perspective that maybe I would broaden out if I were doing it, but which is what you would do. Yeah.
I do actually say in the book that, and it applies even more to my presentation today, which already overran. But why did I not say anything about gender and race? And I do actually think the picture is a bit more positive on gender and to some extent race than it is on class. So you're right. But I'm not sure that means that one should look beyond sociology, because I think even within sociology, the story on gender and race is a bit different. So yeah, I don't disagree with your basic point, but I do think that the modes of influence were different. I mean, you talk about social movements, and they operate outside the conventional political arena, and again, a different set of arguments is probably needed there. So I don't think we actually disagree. And I think the issue about women's representation is I probably had at least as much representation of them in the slides as exists in the real world in terms of the leading figures in sociology of education. Although I did do something which at the time I thought was wrong by talking about Stephen Gore and his colleagues. I should have actually named Diane Ray in particular.
You've done an amazing lot on social class.
Yeah, exactly. So I apologise for that, but I still think I'm reflecting something that is out there and not just in my mind.
I totally agree with you that it's important to have good, strong theoretical accounts of social processes, but one of the things that has isolated sociology is it hasn't always been willing to engage with the evidence. So I think, for example, when school choice was introduced by the Tories in the late 80s, a very reasonable theoretical argument was made this would increase social segregation in the schooling system. And then when Stephen Gore analysed that and found there wasn't any increase in social segregation, certainly up to the mid-90s, there was a lot of people, there was a lot of reaction against that. So rather than engaging with evidence and thinking about how that plays out, people tend to become very entrenched in theoretical positions and actually quite intractable. I think that's one of the reasons social education has become so isolated from government. So I would have a plea that we should always be open to changing our position and to engaging with the widest range of evidence as possible. It's a way of keeping us active and influencing in terms of policy.
Well, I totally agree with you on that. If you were to follow what I said about school choice following Stephen's work, I moderated my position somewhat. But then Stephen's own work has become more equivocal on the issue recently. And that goes back to the John Nisbet thing. You know, we're not going to provide final answers to these things. But certainly procedurally we need to be open to evidence. We can't criticise government ministers for being blind to evidence if we are blind ourselves. But of course the lens we bring to it may be different. And it's not just what the evidence shows in a headline level, it's how you understand it, and that's where I think sociological theory is really important.
The second, just one last thing, you're certainly right in your last point, that the focus this government has on schools as a mechanism to reverse some social class gaps is completely disingenuous and flies against all the evidence, something which I've published myself, I have to say. And yeah, you can see the influence of politics so starkly there. It's very hard to get some impact from that observation, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just make one last comment in relation to the idea this is a four nations? Because while I don't take issue with anything that you've said, I do think when you go into the different jurisdictions, actually you get nuances and kind of dynamics between the relationship between the way in which evidence is considered and policy. There are geography, history, all of that I think changes that. While the fundamentals don't change, but I do think there are nuances which don't necessarily get reflected in the more androcentric kind of.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, and I think I was upfront about the fact that I was talking about English policies, and we had a session at WERA this year on teacher education where it wasn't actually the UK example, but the Southern Irish example raised questions that the UK analysis, let alone the English analysis, didn't entirely take account of. I think we were told in my defence that we didn't need to cover all four nations. But you're absolutely right to draw attention to the fact that this can't be generalised across them.
I think a lot of it can actually, but I do think that they're interesting. And part of what I think this seminar series has been trying to do is actually look at those kind of overlaps and tensions.
Yeah.
So,
but it's the case that mass media coming out of London reach people in all four nations. Lots of them, if they're not actually parents at the moment, they don't even know they have a different school system. And the majority of people in Wales turn out not to understand that health services devolved, they don't know health services devolved to Wales. So they read something in the Daily Mail about a hospital in Birmingham and think that's the policy that's being operated. And I think that, I mean, if you don't have children yourself, why would you know about the foundation phase in Wales, even if you live in Wales? You don't. You read something in a national newspaper from London, and you just assume that's what's happening. Least so in Northern Ireland, and next least in Scotland, I do accept. But we can overestimate the level. I was once on a train with two people who said, well, that must be a comprehensive school because it's streamed. And that was their understanding of comprehensive school, was a streamed school.
I think it works the other way around.
Oh.
I think that there's a lot around academies and so on that completely bypass people in those particular areas in the same way. We have selection, 11, it's just everywhere. I mean, that's the focus of people in that place. They're not paying attention to the...
And I mean, the London influence, is, I would say, I'm sure is least in Northern Ireland, next least in Scotland. But we don't have any data on what ordinary people who aren't parents know about the education system.
Well, the fragmentation doesn't help, does it? The absolute complexity now of it doesn't help either. So, I mean, I work in the local ed party and trying to get them to understand what's happening in education They just don't, you know, it's just too complicated. That's another problem. So, and they're quite interested. So I can, you know, I can imagine that's a problem I think now in England in particular, with all these different ways of organising, and also the NHS the same, of course. But the public totally lost it. They don't know.
And that makes the whole challenge that I'm saying we need to be involved in informing the public mind on education hugely challenging.
I think Ruth's right about the nuancing. I think she's absolutely right to get it that way. And you see, I think Sarah's point, it's not just the daily neighbourhood of the world. I mean, one of the most serial offenders is Fiona Miller in The Guardian. And I've said this to her. She always refers in her column to the education system as if it's an education system with all Guardian readers, you know, and she won't listen to it, because I think there's a political agenda there coming from our partner, which is about the view that it was a grave mistake to devolve.
She knows a hell of a lot more about education than her partner does, I have to say.
Yes, but I think the view is